blood work also gives us clues into like what systems of the body do we need to dive into more. And that is where functional testing really shines with what you can look at, the depth and analysis that you can get from functional testing. And unfortunately, this stuff is not stuff that is going to be done from like your OBGYN or most GI doctors. I don't know if I know of any that have ordered a GI map. I think maybe a couple holistic doctors have, but they are some really powerful tests. We're mainly going to be talking about the GI map and the Dutch test today. Those are two of the main tests that we order for our clients, and both of them give a really cool view into the body and into symptoms and what could be going on and answers for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that we don't run all of these for every client, right? We work certainly by a case basis. There's a lot of clinical experience. We call it the art and science together, because, you're not just going to take a test and the results and treat the test. You're going to support the person and take a bigger picture view as to what's going on with their lifestyle, their diet, their stress, their sleep, all of those things you have to account for. Because if you just get a test and you go after it, you're going to be, you're in the same situation as conventional medicine then, right? It's just a pill for every ill or a supplement for every symptom, or I'm going to, go after things on here that don't even make sense with the person's symptomatology. And that's really what matters to us. And so I wanted to talk about the GI map specifically because this case is a case where they did go to conventional medicine. They've had an endoscopy, they've had a colonoscopy, they've had breath testing, and everything comes back negative. They are miserable, abdominal pain, heartburn, GERD, distension, bloating, and the list goes on. And so I wanted to also give you some clinical pearls if you've had a GI map done of ways that we can pick up trends and patterns for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, things that we can look at from the intestinal health marker section, which is my personal favorite part of the test because it shows us liver, gallbladder function, pancreatic function, beta-glucuronidase, which can be associated with estrogen, which I'm sure Becca will touch on. So if you look to the screen, the first thing that we're going to break down is the pathogen section. And these are more acute. These are things that are moving through the body generally, more what I would call transient versus chronic. And you would probably know if you had some of these. I get a lot of cases where somebody has had vomiting or diarrhea and lo and behold, they were dealing with a case of food poisoning, something like, salmonella or, E. coli, things like that. But on this particular test, this shows a parasite known as Giardia. Giardia is very common in the United States. You can get it from anywhere. Basically, it can live underneath your fingernails for up to 17 days. When we think about life cycles of parasites, they're pretty wild. And so, if we think about, your shoes, you've walked outside and you're picking up your shoes and you're carrying them, your children, your fruits, your vegetables, things that are in meats. So parasites are very common and they're actually commensal to the body in some ways. In this case, this is not a commensal parasite infection. This is a very high parasite infection, and this can cause, specifically Giardia, can cause intolerance to dairy. So people would struggle to have, dairy and then, digest it well. The next page, and this is one that is really, really interesting and fascinating, is the H. pylori and commensal or keystone bacteria page. H. pylori is a type of bacteria that has a corkscrew-like motion and burrows into the lining of the stomach, damaging our parietal cells that produce stomach acid. This can also travel and impact your pancreas as well as your spleen. So it is one that we always want to be on the lookout for. Very commonly seen, this test is DNA sensitive. So it's looking at the DNA of the stool and it's very sensitive to H. pylori. This particular person, as you can see, is very high. They are very symptomatic with H. pylori and their breath test was negative. Well, how can that be? H. pylori and some of the other things that we're going to see for this individual down below in the commensal keystone bacteria section can be covered up by Roseburia, which is a great biofilm producer in the gut microbiome. So we can see that Roseburia, which is the last one on the commensal section, was elevated for this person as well. And so she has a lot of commensal or keystone bacteria that are elevated. These are the good bacteria, meaning, commensal, that we want, but we want them to be in check and in balance. We want them to all be in the green. We don't want them to be too high or too low. The same with our phyla, which really gives us about a 90% view of the gut microbiome, the bacteria in the gut microbiome in total. So that was very good. But then when we go to the next page, this is where it gets quite interesting. What you're going to see here is the opportunistic or overgrowth microbes. She has a SIBO pattern. So we can pick up SIBO patterns on the GI map. And what our rule is, it's called 5 high. So do we have 5 high opportunistic bacteria showing up? And here we do, as well as her commensal overgrowth microbes, which both are associated with different types of SIBO. So that is not, something that we want to see, obviously. So this person is in a very compromised digestive state. And again, like I said, very, very sensitive because she's having a lot of pain. She's having a lot of distension, bloating, and upper GI issues with that heartburn, GERD reflux. Then when we come down to the next section, we have the fungi and yeast section. So this is picking up candida, which indicates mold toxicity. We also can see other viruses here, parasites and worms. I will tell you that it's not often that we catch parasites on a GI map, mainly because parasites are microscopic. Many of them are unseen to the eye. 70% are unseen to the eye, but they also hide and they burrow into places. They're more active around the full moon. This is also only one test, okay? So the last section that I want to touch on here is our intestinal health markers. Again, like I mentioned before, this is my personal favorite part of the test. So what we're going to see for this individual is that she has fat in her stool. So steatocrit can indicate gallbladder issues. Liver is a big detoxification organ that produces something called bile. It's a gastric juice. The gallbladder would be there to store and conjugate bile to then give you the right amount of bile in the right dose at the right time when you're ingesting fats. This person does not have a gallbladder. And what we can see is that she's not producing enough bile, or maybe the bile is very sluggish and peanut butter-like because also her beta-glucuronidase is elevated, which I'll touch on, but estrogen dominance can create peanut butter-like bile, okay? So it becomes very thick and we want it to be thin like liquid because that will help remove cholesterol from the body. It will help latch onto different toxins. It also, we call it the great detergent or the great scrubber, but it will act as an antimicrobial in the small intestine. So it can really help prevent SIBO, what we just saw above. The next one here is elastase 1. This is the pancreatic function. This person needs pancreatic enzyme support. Then we see GI markers, beta-glucuronidase. This is one that allows estrogen to run freely in the body. The way that I describe this, if you think about a magnet, you want to magnetize to metabolized hormones, carcinogens, BPAs, plastics, endocrine disruptors, all those things, and we want to pull them out of the body, right? We want to sweat, pee, or poop them out. This is unmagnetizing things and allowing things to recirculate. It goes back in line to the liver, can cause a lot of bloating for individuals, and again, we do associate this generally with higher levels of estrogen, and estrogen can be high because of this. I've seen that several times. I'm sure Becca has too. Mm-hmm. Occult blood. Don't see anything here. We don't want to see blood in your stool. Then we look at secretory IgA. So this is an immune response. And when it's high like this level, this tells us that the immune system is active. It is hot right now. It is fighting against these pathogens that are present in the body. But over time, similar to what Becca will talk about with cortisol, you will run high and then you just get completely wiped out. And now you've lost your defenses. You've lost that army that you need to defend these pathogens that shouldn't be in the body. So we want that to be about 1250. If all things were homeostatic with secretory IgA, that is also the mucosal barrier marker. So it's our first line of defense. Think about it like the skin on the inside. We don't want it to be leaky, right? We want it to be nice and sticky, latch onto the things and clear them out. Antigliadin, IgA, this is the response to gluten. Proteins found in gluten, wheat, barley, and rye. And then eosinophil activation protein, touched on this a little bit on Friday. You can go back and listen to that podcast episode. I won't beat a dead horse, but this would be something that would warrant, an MRT if this was elevated. And then calprotectin. So this is the gold standard for inflammatory bowel. This individual will be doing a retest. Anytime that you are above 120 on a GI map test, we want to run protocols and retest. And, we would also, in this case, likely recommend seeing a GI doctor, having a colonoscopy done, just making sure that we do check all of the, T's and dot the I's, because inflammatory bowel is obviously a serious condition. So that's at a beautiful, just high level of the GI map.
Very fast.
Very quickly for you, but I hope you can understand how valuable that can be, especially for this individual who went to her doctors saying, I'm in so much pain, and they're just recommending that she take a proton pump inhibitor.
Mm-hmm. And obviously this is a podcast that we want you to watch on YouTube, because we're talking through tests that we're showing you on YouTube. So if you're like, oh my gosh, that was so much information, go to YouTube, find this podcast, watch it on YouTube, because it will make a little bit more sense, especially with what I'm about to talk through, because the Dutch test has a lot of visuals that make it a little bit easier to understand. It kind of looks like hieroglyphics to an extent the first time you look at it, but the more it's such a nuanced test. There's so many elements to this test and layers, and it can tell you so much more about the body other than just hormone levels. So I have 2 Dutch tests here, and they're actually very different. So the first test is a high hormones across the board. And there's a number of reasons that this can happen, not a number, but there's a couple of reasons that this can happen. One is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is essentially a tumor on the adrenals that can overproduce hormones, specifically adrenal, DHEA, high androgens, and then we see really high estradiol, high progesterone. Typically when you see high estradiol and high testosterone, you don't see high progesterone with it, because a lot of times it's stress-driven, it's PCOS patterns, and usually in those cases, people don't have adequate progesterone, and so they then even feel more effects from that really high estrogen and testosterone. So there's a couple of reasons that we would dive into why this is going on, but this is high hormones across the board, beyond high hormones. And then when you look at the cortisol pattern, this is especially the daily free cortisol pattern. This is kind of what we consider a stage 2 dysregulation, where we have now gotten to cortisol is high when it shouldn't be and low when it shouldn't be. And so they have really high cortisol upon waking, and then it actually drops, which is the opposite of what we want it to do. So people wake up really tired, even if they slept the night before, and then they actually start to kind of gain energy throughout the day, which shouldn't happen so much. You should feel more, that initial first few hours of when you're waking up, you feel energy, and then it slowly declines throughout the day so that you can fall asleep at night, right? And it's the opposite of melatonin. In this case, we see really high upon waking. So did we not sleep well and we wake up stressed? Are we waking up already thinking about things right? That's what I'm thinking about, what is going on, right? And then we look at the free and metabolized cortisol. And we're actually going to talk about this in much more detail on an upcoming podcast. But free cortisol is really just kind of about 5 to 10% of what's available for use in the bloodstream. So when you get a blood test of cortisol, that's what you're seeing. Metabolized cortisol is what is going through the liver the entire day. What is your body actually making of cortisol versus what's able to be used and felt. And when you see kind of a disjoint between total amount of free and metabolized, you can infer some things. So in this case, we see really high free cortisol and kind of middle of the road metabolized cortisol. So we know that she's not clearing it very well, right? It's high, it's kind of building up. And that's usually in a lot of cases either a liver problem, so the body isn't detoxing it, or it's a thyroid problem to where hypothyroidism can cause slower clearance of cortisol. So that's one really cool pattern that you can kind of pick up on the Dutch test. And then, like I said, that DHEA also really high. So this adrenal output is just through the roof of hormone production. And so then the next image shows more pathways of hormones. So hormones are kind of I think it's not bunko. The name of that ball game, Blinko. The name of the ball game where you drop the ball at the top and it just bounces around and you don't know where it's going to end up in. That's kind of what hormones do. And they do that based on what's going on in the body. And so, for example, when we're looking at this DHEA pattern, basically you have a master hormone of pregnenolone, which you can't actually see in this picture because it's cut off a little bit. I had to cut it off to show the bottom part. But essentially, pregnenolone filters down into DHEA, and then DHEA can turn into testosterone, androstenedione, and then androstenedione is your androgen hormones that break out into androgenic androsterone, or the beta pathway of etiocalanolone. So etiocalanolone is an androgen, but it doesn't present a lot of the androgen symptoms that people think of when they think of androgenism or hirsutism. So you have hair growth on the face, you have hair loss on the head sometimes, you have more masculine type voice, you have acne in some cases. Those are a lot of times are driven by androsterone pathway, that androgenic pathway. And so I love the Dutch test if we are looking at PCOS cases, if we are looking for androgenism, if we are looking at weight loss resistance, because it gives us a ton of information on all of those. And then I also love it for PMS cases and like estrogen dominance assumptions. But there's these little dotted lines that go from androstenedione and testosterone to our estrogens. And there are 3 types of estrogens. You have estrone, which is E1, mostly dominant in postmenopause and in pregnancy. Estradiol, which is the main estrogen in the premenopausal years. And then estriol, which is kind of a byproduct of estradiol and estrone. So what we can gather from estrogens is the pathways that they go down and how much of each one we have. So if someone has really high estriol, that usually is gut imbalances or really high levels of oxidative stress in the body. And so if someone shows this pattern, I'm like, okay, I get more than just hormones here. I can start to understand how high levels of inflammation are present, kind of tracking back to the androgens. If someone has really high androgens and testosterone and low other hormones, that's also a really big blood sugar dysregulation and inflammation pattern. So I can start to kind of infer why this is happening. And then I'm not just going towards hormones to address the situation. I'm like, hey, okay, we might not even need to touch hormones. We just need to get the body less inflamed. We need to get blood sugar regulated, and we need to open the liver detoxification patterns. So the big piece on this page, other than that, is how estrogen's detoxing. So estrogen can kind of detox down 3 different pathways mainly. You have your 2-OH pathway, which is green, rightfully so, because this is our pathway that we want to be detoxing down. This is the de-escalating pattern. Estrogen can be estrogenic. It can drive a lot of things that we don't want in the body. It's kind of this Goldilocks thing. Estrogen's amazing when it's in the right amounts and when it is not acting amiss, right? And so we want it going down that 2-OH pathway because that kind of is an anti-inflammatory pathway for estrogen. The 4-OH pathway we don't want. The 4-OH is where estrogen can have DNA mutations and create a higher possibility of things like estrogen-based cancers. So think breast cancer, think uterine cancer. We do not want those, obviously. And so if we see that 4-OH pathway, we can do things to push it away from that. We love things like high-dose cruciferous vegetables or actual supplements to help kind of move away from the 4-OH pattern, while we also work other pieces like gut, liver detoxification abilities, things that will also affect that. And then we can see, that 16-OH pattern, again, like I said, is that gut dysfunction. We can sometimes see this with improper tissue growth. So we'll see a lot of times people that get fibroids or cysts or things like that have a really high dominance in that 16-OH. So it's just different things that we can infer and then be able to address through this. And then the last piece on this page is the methylation. So a lot of people know about methylation with the MTHFR gene. This does not give you your full body methylation pattern. It gives you more how you're methylating estrogen. And so we can infer, right? If someone's a really low methylator or a really high methylator, there are things that you can understand from that. So if someone has really low methylation, they might do well with some extra B vitamin support, right? They may do well with some NAC or some milk thistle or other liver supports. If someone has really high methylation, they're probably going to be a very sensitive individual. Those people tend to have more anxiety, have more mood disruptions. And so there's things you can do to slow down methylation a little bit. And so I love the Dutch for seeing those patterns. And then really briefly, I'll show a very different situation. And this is all low hormones. This is estrogen dominance, but low hormones. So on this page, you see low estrogen, but it's more than progesterone. And so this individual was experiencing more estrogen dominant symptoms. They were still having heavy periods. They were still having some clotting. They were still having really bad PMS. Even though estrogen was low, it was still dominant comparatively to progesterone. And so we see, right, that really low hormones can still produce hormone-like symptoms. And then in this pattern, we see kind of more dominant testosterone and DHEA, which we'll see a lot of times with our athletes, our females that train a lot, maybe females that have a chronic dieting history. Those are all kind of patterns that we'll see with this. And this is another situation where cortisol was high, total free, but metabolized was low. And so that's that hypothyroid pattern, that liver dysfunction pattern. And then the second page, we'll see actually, so this is a premenopausal female, but the estrone was really high. And so in that case, we know, okay, look, the androgens and testosterone are kind of the dominant hormones in this situation. And so they are aromatizing into that estrone. They're making that estrone even higher than it should be. And so a lot of things that you can kind of gather from the Dutch test in terms of not just sex hormones, but what are the adrenals doing? How is that person detoxing those hormones? What pathways are they going down? And what insight can that give us into, their inflammation levels, their gut function? I didn't include a couple of other pages, but there is an organic acids page that gives a little bit of insight into their neurotransmitters, if they're low on B vitamins, if they have, neural inflammation, which is a really cool marker on the Dutch test. And then also a little bit of insight into the gut, even more with indican, which can give you insight into, stomach acid levels to an extent and kind of what the state of the gut is, basically, in a very broad view. So I love the Dutch test. It is a really, really cool layered test. It's obviously a lot to look at, which is why I always tell people, because a bunch of people ask on my social media, how do you get this test? Mm-hmm. I'm like, you don't want this test if you are not having someone read it to you, because it is going to cause tons of anxiety of like, what is even going on? I just paid $350 plus for this test. Like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. I don't know what to do about it. And it's a urine-based test. And the other reason that I like this so much comparatively to sex hormones from a blood serum standpoint is that you are testing 4 points throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And so especially for cortisol, it is one of my favorite tests to be able to look at, not just a point in time. Like maybe you were just stressed out when you were at the doctor, right? Maybe you just didn't get enough sleep the night before. This gives you what is the true state of the adrenals. And especially for females that are dealing with like unwanted weight gain and don't know why it's happening, low adrenal function is such a big driver of that. And again, we're going to talk about that on a much deeper level on another podcast coming up soon, but we love functional testing to be able to dive deeper into symptoms, into what could possibly be driving things. Like they give you clues no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, loading and digestion, all of the things. And, again, what we're going to say is that there's so many different functional tests that you can use out there, right? Like we have hair and mineral analysis testing, genetic testing. We love blood chemistry. That's where everyone starts no matter what. We have total tox testing to look at mycotoxins and mold and environmental toxins and heavy metals and all of those things. And so it's going to be case by case what we choose to run and what we think is most imperative. I would say I think that Becca and I both, as well as our practitioners, really try to be cautious with the amount of tests that we're running, because I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, it's more than just looking at a result on a test, right? It's really being able to align with the person, again, their health history, what's their labs work telling us, what are all 12 systems of the body doing and struggling with, and then being strategic in the process with how we address these things. And so we believe if somebody's coming in, we're going to do that full blood work analysis, look at 320 symptoms plus, there's a lot of other questionnaires that we look at because we want to see how you feel day to day, because the ultimate goal is, yes, to optimize things internally, but most importantly is to get you feeling better, because what is life if we walk around feeling miserable every day, right? And so it's, a place that we start, and then we're able to adjust the diet accordingly, put some supports in where we need to, focus mostly though on lifestyle factors, right? Because if we don't ever focus on the lifestyle factors and we just get these tests and we try to take some supplements, you will never get better. You will never heal. Trust me, because we have many people who come in, and this is also, I want to touch on why we don't do these tests one-off. We have a lot of people that have come to our practice with test in hand from 6 months, 12 months ago. And they did like a very, what I would call incomplete or partial protocol. Maybe it wasn't bad, right? They bought some of these supplements and, did them, but there was no other guidance. And when we think about both gut health, but also how the body works in hormones, there's strategy behind it and the way that we address things. And when we're thinking about the immune system too, which is kind of the overarching umbrella to everything, we always have to keep that into account, especially if somebody is, dealing with autoimmune or is on the brink of, autoimmune because they have so much inflammation and so much antibody, indications on their blood work. And so we don't do the GI map one off and then write a protocol for someone because there's so much nuance to taking you through those phases. There's a lot of things that we're adjusting. We're changing the diet. We're changing the types of supplements. We're pulling things out. We're adding things in. We're adjusting based upon the person, how they're feeling. Again, because symptoms are always going to trump testing. But we wanted to at least highlight two affordable and very valuable tests that we have utilized in our practice. Some of the other ones that we do utilize, they're more complex and they are a little bit more expensive, but we thought that this would be helpful for you to understand in terms of just gut health and hormone health. If you have gone to a doctor, OBGYN or a GI doctor, and you're just not getting help, right? You are one of those individuals who, hey, your labs look fine. Or you're like my client last week who got results from her OBGYN and it's a completely whack panel that she got. I was like, we're missing several things. I'm not sure what she was, trying to deduce from this weird panel that you have. We want a complete picture because we don't want to leave any stone unturned, right? We don't want to be doing guesswork with people. So again, it is an art and a science as we go through this, process in our Healthy Gut, Happy Hormones program, but hopefully that gives you some insight into why we use these things and how valuable they can be. If you guys need help on your journey and you are like, yes, that's me, I have those symptoms, always schedule a free call with our team. The link is in the show notes, and we hope that you have a fantastic week. Happy Monday.